Hi, Jeremy here, Damn Good Doctors Club. In today's video, we're looking at ways of knowing, which means we're exploring logic and intuition. These are two sides of the same coin with our clinical clarity processes. What do I mean by logic and intuition? Well, there's different ways to know things, aren't there, right? When a patient comes in and they're presenting a certain way, sometimes some people, depending on how you're wired, you're more intuitive and you just get an answer, or you get the next step, or you get a acupuncture point or an herb or a supplement or whatever it is. It just comes to you. And you can't explain why necessarily. Other people, depending on how you're wired, you might have more of a rationalized, logical process. So both of these ways of knowing are valid. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to expand on this, and I want to show you a whole bunch of mental models and how they all come together so that you can start to take not only it's good to lean on our strengths, right? We want to do that, but you can take your strong points, which you're naturally good at, and you can start to build the world around that. And at the same time, start to understand your blind spots and start to fill that in as well, because this is only going to increase your confidence. One of the things that I've noticed is that practitioners a lot of times very intuitive and know what to do, especially with Eastern medicine. But I mean, I'm speaking from that background: Eastern medicine, Chinese medicine, these kinds of things, herbs, acupuncture, qigong, right? It doesn't matter your modality. The same thing happens in functional medicine. The same thing happens with chiropractors, right? There's incredibly intuitive body workers. There's all kinds of people that can function in an intuitive way. And there's all kinds of people that function more in a rational, like more logical type of way. It's just a predominance of traits. But what I've noticed is a lot of times people who are very intuitive and kind of like just know things, they have almost imposter syndrome, because there's this little hole in their confidence because they can't necessarily articulate and explain the logic behind it. Oftentimes we wind up reverse rationalizing what it is we did. Like, our intuition tells us what to do, we do it, it works, and then somebody might say, well, why'd you do that? How'd you know? And then instead of just saying, I don't know how I know, right? It's just intuition. Instead of that, we come up with some reverse rationalization. And actually, as a quick side tangent, this is one of the little bones that I have to pick with Eastern medicine, because a lot of the ways that we get taught, especially in higher continuing education from kind of established practitioners and people that have been at it, 20 plus years, they'll have an assortment of case studies, and they'll be able to show what they did and the results they got. But when you try to go back and figure out the process of how they knew to do the thing, that's oftentimes a pretty washy gray area. And that makes it inspiring to see these kinds of results, but also very, very difficult to reproduce, because the process, if we don't have an articulated process, then we can't. This is a scientific method, right? You need to be able to repeat your experiments. You need to be able to have your hypothesis and then know your process. So if we have this kind of washy, vague, I don't know, I just knew kind of bridge, it's not that it's invalid. It is valid. And there's another way we can start looking at this so that we can start to fill in some of the blind spots so that we can then create more of a replicable process. Not to create a factory where we just churn people through, but to make sure that we have a dynamic and comprehensive clinical algorithm of how we're thinking and operating, so that everybody can have the same types of opportunities when they come into our world. Because sometimes with the intuition and logic, it seems like a battle, right? Because you've got these intuitive thoughts that come in, and depending on, here's the deal, okay? Your intuitive side of your brain operates more in the subconscious, which is much more perceptive than the conscious mind, which means it's also more easily influenced by outside events. So basically all of our biases, our logical fallacies, right? All the things we look at in terms of how people think and the kind of the little traps we get stuck into. They mainly call it biases and heuristics, right? That's where that lives. And what I mean by that is you have things like a bias towards recency. So if you've just read something in a book, or you just went to a seminar, or you just attended a webinar, and it was all about the thyroid or something, you're going to have that lens when you view your next patient. It's just going to be top of mind because it's what you just learned, but that doesn't mean that it's the most appropriate thing for that specific person, right? So when we operate from the realm of just the subconscious, there's a lot of power there, but unfortunately the downside of that is there's also a lot of external influence that can get in because it's so perceptive, right? Does that mean turn off your subconscious and only be a logical, rational? No, not at all. Not at all. We are here to combine. We're getting out of the two-corner fallacy, right? So if you don't know what that is, you're going to have to explore my world a little more and find where I'm explaining two-corner fallacy, forced binaries, right? One or the other. Oh, I want to be intuitive or I want to be logical and rational. It's not an or, it's an and. We need to expand. Right? We need to be able to bridge that. That's the yin and the yang of it, right? That's the alchemy. It's always about taking the yin and the yang and finding the harmony, right? Not just picking one and discarding the other thing entirely. So when we look at our intuition, if that's strong, right, then that means we also need to make sure that we're building up strengths in our logical, rational ability to articulate things, because that is one of the problems I've noticed, is that a lot of practitioners that are very intuitive have a hard time explaining what it is they do and why, and they get frustrated, and they also feel like a lot of patients can't understand them. They feel like they're talking past the patients, or they don't have the right words for it. And some people are fine with that. Some patients are like, I don't know, just do your magic, and it's a good relationship. But there are a lot of other very rich relationships that we could unlock and have access to if we can learn how to articulate some of this intuitive language a little bit better. So this has been a huge key for me. I'm unlocked so much of my potential in my practice to be able to start to articulate and communicate what's going on, especially coming from a background with Eastern medicine where a lot of it's a little more in the intuitive realm as it is. There's kind of one heavy foot in that, and then we have to figure out how to communicate things in a more relatively reductionist, scientific, logical, rational way because of the culture we live in, right? It's like Western culture. We operate in more of this kind of linear, logical thing. So we have to be able to translate and move between. The more gracefully we can articulate and move between those two realms, the more people we can help, and the better we're going to feel inside about our work. Because this is one of the things with the kind of imposter syndrome, is people who are very intuitive, they can back up their intuition oftentimes with results, but sometimes that's not enough, because there's a little voice inside your head going, yeah, but if somebody really grilled me, I wouldn't know how to explain what it is I did. So I'm going to be sharing how to look at all this. We're going to get down and draw a couple pictures. So let's get started with that. So there's a model from psychology regarding skill development that I think is helpful here. And oftentimes it's presented as a pyramid or a triangle, and we have 4 distinct steps to this. At the bottom level, we've got unconscious incompetence. And what that means is that you're not good at something, you don't have the skill, right? You can't do it, and you're unconscious of the fact that you even have a weakness there. You have no idea you can't do the thing, right? And it's okay. This isn't like judgments on us as humans. Everybody has this. This is universal, and it's good to start to shine a light on these different stages. The next stage is when you still have the incompetence, right? The skill, you can't do it, but you become now conscious of this, and this is conscious incompetence. And this means that we know that we don't know how to do the thing. Okay, that's the next step towards becoming skilled. After that, we start to work and apply ourselves, and we start to develop conscious competence, which means we know how to do the thing, and we know that we know how to do the thing. Okay, there's a little bit of metacognition here, so I'm going to divide these up so it's a little easier to see. The last step is unconscious competence. And that's where we know how to do the thing, but it's just become a part of us, right? It's more like flow states. And what I find is that this is where a lot of practitioners tend to operate when they have more intuitive treatment strategies, when they just kind of know things, and they don't necessarily know how they know. They don't necessarily have a logical framework where they can like go back and forth and explain step by step how they arrived at their treatment or their conclusions or their interventions or whatever it is. This is the intuitive, right? It's fast. It's system 1. It's just moving quick. We can train this, right? And when you do enough reps here with conscious competence and you start to develop an experience bank, it will move into unconscious competence, right? So if you go from here to here, you'll still have the ability to explain why it is you're doing what you're doing. But oftentimes, depending on people's constitutions or their skill sets or their personality or whatever it is that makes us have our own unique strengths and talents, some people just start out operating here and they're kind of like geniuses, right? There's kind of this little like thing where you have a gift and you're just very good at the thing, but you can't necessarily explain it back. You can't necessarily teach it. You can't necessarily replicate it in other settings. So what that does is if you don't have this bit developed, it can create some sense of imposter syndrome or like there's a weakness to be guarded. And one of the ways you can know if you have this or not, there's a litmus test, and it's not always comfortable. And this is one of those cry in the dojo kind of experiences, because if somebody asks you why, do you get defensive or do you get curious? Because if somebody asks you why and you feel like that's infringing on a blind spot that you have, your ego is going to bristle and you're going to try to defend yourself. If somebody asks you why and you get curious and inquisitive, that's a different way to handle that. So you want to make sure that This is okay to operate from. This is great. A lot of people strive to get to this like top level, but you want to also make sure that you can backfill and be able to be conscious around your competence, not just unconsciously gliding through life. You want to be able to control it, right? It's not that one's better than the other. It's just that when you have an imbalance and you can't move from one to the other, there's a sense where we start to get stuck or we start to doubt ourselves, especially when it's time to move into a next phase of practice. For example, I get these questions in our group where practitioners are talking about kind of taking things from the brick and mortar and then moving it online, as I recommend for most folks. It's such a liberating way to do things, especially when you do it right. You have nonlinear business models and you're not tied to consultations and calls and all that. You don't want to be stuck to a phone or stuck to a Zoom screen or whatever. You want to be able to have things operating non-linearly without any appointments whatsoever, which is what we do within our model. And it works great. The patients love it. The practitioners love it. It is possible, but it does require an upskill. You've got to learn new layers of skills. So one of the things that I've seen is practitioners who have unconscious competence, they can operate in brick and mortar, one-to-one, face-to-face situations, and something happens, and it's valid and it's real. And some of it has to do with resonance and just the rub of the vibration of the practitioner and the vibration of the patient. Something happens there. But when we start to think about moving online, because of all the amazing things that it offers, we can get a little bit defensive around that and go, well, I don't know exactly what I do and how it works, and I don't know how to replicate that online. Which is, I think, one of the strengths of our model and the way we do things is that I build a strong foundation on this kind of stuff, right? How do we transfer this resonance? How do we build a culture? How do we become leaders? How do we have these deep human connections and transformative processes while using technology to do it? This is where I live. I do this online. I mean, I'm doing it right now. We're having a conversation, right? And it's through a video format, but this stuff is changing how you see the world. We're making transformations all the time. So as long as you're aligned to that, you can actually do this online, no problem, if you build the requisite skill sets. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes to make this possible and to make it smooth, but it absolutely can be done. Now, the other thing to do is to say, okay, why don't we just take a look at your clinical clarity algorithms, right? And your actual processes, and start to bring more mindfulness and more consciousness to that so that you can learn your own mind better, right? Isn't that cool? We don't have to be defensive here. We can explore this, we can be curious, and we can actually start to go inwards and start to uncover things about ourselves and like how this is your brain, right? How our brain actually is thinking about things. We can start to learn that. We can shine a light on that, and we can start to map it out so that we now have, instead of this feeling like we just kind of reach into the darkness of our subconscious and like pull out a little gem here and there, like these little clinical pearls that I just knew, right? Instead of that, we can now have architected out basically like algorithmic decision trees and find the gems so that when patient A comes through, we can navigate them and go, oh, okay, this is where you're going to land here, right? The word algorithm sounds very computerized, but it doesn't mean mechanical and it doesn't mean soulless. It means having if-then decision points. And what this does is this ensures that the next person who comes in will have the same opportunity to navigate your clinical algorithm with you as their guide without all the biases that come with the unconscious competence, right? If our subconscious is driving all the time, like I've mentioned, then it can be easily influenced depending on the time of day, depending on how hungry you are, depending on what you saw on the internet the day before, what you read in a book, right? Whatever's on your mind, there's going to be all kinds of biases. Sunken cost fallacy, like whatever you've been doing with the patient, you might just keep doing, but harder. There's a lot of little traps that we can fall into here. So what I would offer is that this isn't either or, it's both. And as we develop this algorithm, we can take some of this unconscious competence and we use that to start to create new branches and new places where we can take people on this journey together. And we map it. So now we have both. We've got reliability, we've got ways to explain and differentiate what's going on. We don't have to feel like we have a weak spot because we've bolstered that up with logic and with reasoning, but we also have still the access to our intuition. And here's the really interesting piece of this. It's a paradox, right? Because it's like, oh, logic or intuition, which one? No, it's both. And actually, the better you get at this, the faster your logical mind will start to move through this until actually your intuition takes over and now becomes trained. So this actually becomes the same thing. And you'll wind up with an interlocking web of all these clinical pearls and all these amazing things that you can navigate very, very quickly with a trained intuition. Some people don't trust their intuition. because they're worried they're going to make mistakes, or their intuition's wrong, or they can't explain it. And that's okay. When you do this kind of work, your intuition gets better. It's just like riding a bike or driving a car or learning any kind of complicated skill for the first time. You're going to have all these kind of little pieces to keep track of, right? And you have to become consciously competent at that. You can drive a car, right? But you have to think about it while you're driving. Eventually, you get good at it, your intuition takes over, and you're unconsciously competent at driving a car, meaning you can drive a car while having a conversation with the person next to you, right? The passenger. You can drive a car while listening to an audiobook. These kinds of things happen because you take very difficult tasks and you just get better at them and you better organize them until all of a sudden your intuition is now trained. And then that task, this thing that used to be multitasking, has now condensed down into one thing, which is very, very easy for your subconscious to manage, and you'll become more accurate. So you get to be faster and more accurate. It's very cool. As far as personality and resonance goes and human connection, because that does play a huge part, right? These are all the things that you're doing. These are all the what's, right? All these little interventions. And then there's the why, which is like, well, because the patient presented this way, or we tried a certain method and they got this response, which tells me I need to pivot and go here. That's all your why. The how of it is how you show up. What kind of personality you have, what kind of personal cultivation you've done. What quirks do you have, right? How supportive are you? What kind of leadership skills do you have? Those are all the things that start to determine that resonance of how your Shen, your spirit, right? Shen, S-H-E-N, like this, Shen. In Eastern medicine, it basically just means like the presence coming off of you. I know it's a deep term, I'll oversimplify here, but one of my teachers used to say that a sign of developing Shen is how people spontaneously feel when they're around you, right? It's your vibe, it's your mojo, it's who you are. So you can develop that, and you can still use online vehicles, right? Whether it's a chat group, or you're doing videos, or you're writing, or you make a podcast, however you want to start to communicate what you have inside, your Shen is going to be all over that. And that's going to resonate, and that's going to connect, and that's actually medicinal. It's going to be helping people. Your processes can be part of the healing, part of the medicine, is just the experience of what it's like walking into your world or your paracosm. It's really quite interesting. So while we've got this model kind of top of mind, I'm going to show you something else here, because they show this as a pyramid, but let's go a little bit deeper, because we can take it to something I think is more realistic. We can look at a grid, and we can say, all right, here's our unconscious, here's conscious, right? Here is competence, right? We can do it. Here's incompetence. We can't do it, no skills yet. And now we've got a grid. So we can look at, see the bottom one here, look, unconscious incompetence. That's here, unconscious incompetence. That's here. So we'll put number 1 right there, right? Number 2 is conscious incompetence. So I didn't know I wasn't good at the thing. Now I do know I'm not good at the thing. And now number 3, conscious competence. I am good at the thing, but I have to think about it, right? That's like driving and having to really think about every little thing you're doing. And then number 4, unconscious competence, right? Flow state, I'm very good at this. What happens in reality, I find, as we upskill ourselves, is we'll pick something, whatever it is, whatever skill, and we start to develop it, and we move through this process, right? Just like that. And then we'll find the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. So as soon as we become very good, unconsciously competent at something, then we start to hit a wall of things we didn't know we weren't good at. And this is the next level. And then we go through the same process. We start to look at that and go, okay, I guess I'm not very good at that. I need to learn. I need to get better. I need to find a teacher, a mentor, a peer group, a community, whatever. I need resources to help me get to the next level of being good at this. And then the better you get at things, the more automatic they become. So really, as we grow, as people, humans, and as practitioners, we're going around this thing over and over and over and over and over again, right? This is always happening. When this stops happening, we stop growing. Something to be aware of, right? So this part, the incompetence side, oftentimes doesn't feel good, right? We feel like we're at the edge of our comfort zone. It's not nice. You feel your skill gaps. You have to start to get, especially here when we're conscious of it, you can feel the skill gaps. And we feel all kinds of things, like we feel weak, we feel imposter syndrome, we feel frustrated, we feel anxiety, we feel all kinds of things. Depending on your growth mindset, this might actually feel good to you, because now you've got a place to start to aim your intent, right? And start to make yourself like expand into that. But don't be surprised if this is not comfortable. And even this one's not super comfortable when you start to become consciously competent, right? When you start to go, okay, I can drive the car, but I have to really think about it. Oh, okay, I can navigate the patients through this, right? My flow chart, but boy, it's cumbersome, right? Trying to make this thing, trying to really map out what's in my brain. You know, you're going to have a lot of feelings around that. But once you have that built, it starts to become unconsciously competent. You can start to move people through very, very quickly, but not just move them through quickly, also be able to explain why, if anybody were to ask. Not that you're going to be cross-examined or put on the stand, but imagine maybe you want to train a mentor or colleague or something, like you want a mentee. You're going to take somebody under your wing, an associate or something like that. You can't just have them watch you do miracles and expect them to pick that up by osmosis, right? We have to be able to explain some of this. Now, whether or not you give them your whole map and say, here's the map, learn it, or you help them learn how to create their own, right? That's going to be part of the deal. But I've noticed for me that when I observe practitioners, they're doing this, pulling these rabbits out of hats, and it's amazing. And then we have to start to create our own versions of these flow charts after the fact and try to figure out how all this stuff works behind the scenes. So my angle is let's get really good at this so we can start to take clinical pearls and we can thread them together into something that's actually usable and that gives all the patients we come into contact with an equal opportunity to have the same type of comprehensive process, right? Instead of always having to feel like we're kind of on the spot, having to snap our fingers and just know what to do. These are both valid, right? You got to understand that these are definitely both valid. So what we'll look at here is another way people kind of augment this model is they'll say unconscious incompetence, right? This is going to live in the realm of unconscious is going to have to do with intuition, right? Unconscious competence is going to have to do with intuition. Conscious competence is going to have to do with rational thinking, right? And conscious incompetence is going to have to do with rational thinking. And then intuition with incompetence means it's basically incorrect, right? Rationally incorrect over here, rationally correct over here, and intuitively correct over here. So you want to start to figure out kind of these quadrants. Where's your strength? What can you work on? Just because it's incorrect doesn't mean you're wrong or bad as a person, right? It just means that your intuition's not right here. You don't have the competence, you don't have the skill set. So oftentimes there's a blind side with intuition where you need to understand this is kind of like a little bit deeper than I meant to go in this video, but I think we should talk about it because when we are unconsciously incompetent, we tend to develop an intuition, a subconscious like rationalization that's not really rational. It's just based on rationalizing something intuitive. And we tend to tell ourselves stories about how whatever it is that we're incompetent at, we don't need to worry about that anyway. It doesn't matter, right? Or we have some other strength that offsets this. We'll do all these there's all this weird stuff that happens with our egos to try to keep us unconscious of this area. And this is part of growth, is learning how to challenge that so that you can move from this unconscious kind of protected weak spot where you rationalize and try to keep your own mind out of it. It's really interesting how we sabotage there. Not always, but I mean, there's a tendency to do it. You have to be able to break through that and put that kind of internal pressure on yourself to see what's there so that you can then move into that next stage where you're incorrect, but your rational mind is now starting to like get to work on it, where you can start to do some autology, right? Some looking inside, some knowing yourself, and start to actually just change these processes and start to figure out what's it going to take to get from here to here now, right? Because we can't go from here to here. We can't go from not knowing that we don't know something, right, to knowing that we know. And that's another model they use, like military strategy and things like that. There's this whole idea of known knowns, and this is going to sound kind of complicated with the language. It's almost like a Dr. Seuss book or something. But basically, if you have unconscious incompetence, then you have unknowns, right? And you don't even know that you have them. They're unknown unknowns. And as we start to move up, they're still unknown because we're incompetent. We can't do the thing, right? But these are now at least known unknowns. Now we can do something about that. Eventually we get to where we have known knowns, meaning we know the thing. I told you it's going to sound like a Dr. Seuss book. But now we know what we know, right? And then we get to this step where it's actually unknown knowns, where we know how to do something, but we don't even know how to explain it, right? It's a thing we know how to do, but we don't know. It's just it's like driving automatically, right? We want to be able to kind of merge these two so that we don't blindside ourselves. If these kinds of themes and conversations are helpful for you with your personal and professional development, you may find there's an entire world to explore within the Damn Good Doctors Club. You can apply for guest membership for free. There's an application. You'll find it's around here somewhere, probably below the video. You'll find it. You're a detective. I'll take a look at your application. If you seem like an outstanding fit for our culture, then I'll get you in just as soon as I can. All right, talk soon. Get to work.